Of the 23 inquiry members to accompany Wilson to Paris, all were from the social or political sciences. Nearly all had a prestigious background in the classical arts, many graduating magna cum laude, and along the way establishing fraternal connections that would guarantee long, distinguished international careers. The inquiry was hardly bipartisan, its membership largely made up of progressives and staunch advocates of an Anglo-American establishment and a future society run by expert opinion rather than democratic tradition. The inquiry was essential in the creation of a society we see today whose consent is largely manufactured by experts far outside the realm of public accountability. In fact, the arrival of the inquiry signifies an incredibly important turning point in modern human history. For the first time, we see unelected men of private academic affairs, with no responsibility to either the government organ that hired them or the people they serve, taking a central role in determining national borders around the world. All in a premeditated, coordinated, some might even say conspiratorial effort to reorient the world more towards an international order of law, or as they say themselves openly, a new world order. The inquiry members essential in the creation of the UN, the U.S. Foreign Office, and the U.S. intelligence community, the International Labor Organization, and two of the most prominent advocates of international cooperation, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. These men of the inquiry and their interlocking associations to Wall Street, military intelligence, mass media, Ivy League academia, and non-profit research foundations like Russell Sage make them an interesting historical study to be sure, a study somehow mysteriously absent from the public record until now, a study we at the History of Propaganda look forward to documenting in future episodes as this strange experiment in social engineering has finally found its historian.
Okay. Check, check, 1, 2. Welcome to the History of Propaganda, Brandeis Part 7, Philosophy of Law. It looks like I'm registering. Check, check, 1, 2. You guys can see me all good? Hopefully you heard that intro. If you're watching this now, it means that the volume worked. August 31st, 2025 today. And I wanted to show that intro for a reason. That is from one of our videos on the creation of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. And to show you just how they did that, they actually started recruiting political and social scientists from Ivy League universities like Harvard, Columbia, Yale. And so they're all economists, professors of history, professors of medieval history, and that's from our From the Embers of War series, okay? And that inquiry is the predecessor to the CFR. All formulated in the late summer of 1917. And I'll bring up a picture here of them for you so you can see exactly who we're dealing with. And I'll just find the one with their credentials on it. Okay. Should be looking at a group of men, a black and white photo. This is taken in the Hotel Crillon in Paris, the day of or the next day after they had arrived with Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. You can see at the very top, it says intelligence chiefs So these are not only the predecessors to the CFR, but the predecessors to the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA. So this is really the founding of U.S. intelligence, modern U.S. intelligence, plus U.S. foreign policy. At the same time here, Louis Brandeis is in Paris, and he's finally completing uh, the text of the founding document of Israel, the Balfour Declaration. And I've shown you these guys before, but I want anybody that's sort of new to the program and new to this story, this is what I want to show you, that they're all social scientists. Okay, these guys have been corralled. And the leading guy is James T. Shotwell. Okay, so when you looked at those, the two quotes in that intro, they were by James T. Shotwell. It's that guy. He's Canadian, University of Toronto, Bachelor of Arts, Columbia University PhD, Director of Research at Carnegie, 1917. That's what he was doing at the time of these pictures, and he's really one of the first members of the inquiry, and he was given the task of recruiting all of these men, along with Louis Brandeis, Walter Lippmann. Okay, so those are really the first founding lifetime members of the CFR. Professor of International Relations at Columbia U. And when it says FFCFR, that means founding father of the CFR. So you can see in the middle there, Isaiah Bowman sitting with his leg crossed. He's a founding father of the CFR too. He's a lifetime founding member. The real life Indiana Jones, but you can see he's got a Harvard MA. At the time, he's president of the American Geographical Society, and that's where they set up and start drawing all of their maps so that they can redraw Central Europe. You can see right directly behind Isaiah Bowman, Charles Seymour. He's skull and bones. He's a future president at Yale, but he got a Bachelor of Arts at King's College, which is Columbia, and a Bachelor of Arts from Yale, as well as a PhD. He's a founding father of the CFR. You can see a lot of them are presidents of associations, like the American Archaeological Association, or the American Economic Association, or the American Historical Association, like Charles Homer Haskins on the bottom right there. But they're all professors of history, of economics, of medieval history. They all have master's degrees. Most of them have masters of arts degrees. You can see upper left, William Lynn Westerman. He's a Near and Middle East specialist. Slave systems of Greek and Roman antiquity. So these guys are very, very well versed in history. And so all of them have a liberal arts background. All of them are considered social scientists or political scientists. You can see Alan Abbott Young sitting in the front row, third from the left. He's a disciple of Richard T. Ely, who we're going to get into today. And he's a professor at London School of Economics. That's what the LSE at the bottom is, a Harvard professor. You can see George Louis Beer sitting to his right, to the left of the picture. Columbia University, Bachelor of Arts, Master of Arts, Professor of European History, student of Herbert Levi Osgood and Imperial Historians. He's one of the key Anglo-American Rhodes Roundtable members. It's a liaison between the American Progressives and the Fabian Society and the British War Department. Men like Lord Milner, Philip Kerr, Eustace Percy. Two of those men were living at the House of Truth. Okay, so this is how they created the CFR, was gathering social scientists, political scientists, professors from Ivy League universities, and we see the same pattern going on today. Okay, so we're going to get into a few things today, but we're going to do a little prologue. Okay, and so we're going to start right here. Hopefully you're looking at Wilhelm von Humboldt. And So I wanted to show you here that the PhD system that I'm sure that many Americans and many in the Western world think started in the United States actually started in Prussia or Germany in the mid 19th century. So AI here in this case is correct. In answering my question, you can see that I proposed who founded the PhD system. It says the modern PhD system originated in 19th century Germany with the founding of the University of Berlin, now Humboldt University. It's named after this guy. He's one of the founders of our Western education system. So he championed the integration of teaching and original research. This German model, which required doctoral candidates to produce and defend a dissertation based on their own research, quickly spread to other universities across Europe and eventually North America, establishing the foundation for the PhD as it is known today. So this is very interesting that for a doctoral, like for a PhD, you have to do a doctoral dissertation, which is often deep historical research. And it's supposed to be unique and original research. So this is actually a source of a lot of my material, is these dissertations that are presented in the highest levels of American university. My neighbor just started up his chainsaw. I'm just going to go close the window. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I further pushed AI to see just how much it knew, asking who was the first American to receive a PhD in the PhD system, because this is important. This is really how the K through 12, our modern education system, was founded, and psychology and the social sciences, as we're going to show you. And actually, we've shown you in Brandeis Part 6, Science of Law, the sort of origins of the social sciences in America came from Prussia, and the same sort of system applies here. And these German intellectuals demanded that the Americans coming over for this master degree or the PhD have at least a background in the trivium or the liberal arts. So they've all gone to, we've shown you this pattern. They've all gone to state colleges and received at least a BA, Bachelor of Arts. So they're well versed in grammar, logic, rhetoric. So they come to Germany already understanding how to research who, what, why, where, when. A lot of them will be editors. And so ultimately, this question isn't answered accurately. Okay, so the first American woman to receive a PhD was Helen McGill White, who earned her degree in 1877. That's not what I asked. And this is about 60 years too late if we're looking for the first American to receive a PhD, because I already know who it is, and I was just seeing how much AI actually knew. And so then I asked who was the first American PhD. I reworded it a little, and it gave me the first African American PhD, 1861, still really, really late. If we're looking for the first American PhD student coming up from out of Prussia, they get close here because they say other key firsts include Granville Stanley Hall, first American PhD in psychology. And this is totally accurate. And this is one of the characters that founded our Western education system. Some of you may be familiar with that name or have heard that name before. Remember it from your days in school, Granville Stanley Hall, like Horace Mann or Edward Everett. And Edward Everett is the guy that receives the first PhD. For whatever reason, it wants to search now. Who was the first American to receive a Prussian PhD? And it says Franz Boas, born in the Kingdom of Prussia, received his PhD in physics from the University of Kiel in 1881. But that's not accurate. I mean, it's accurate in that Franz Boas, and this guy's a very important progressive figure to understand too, but he's not the first American to receive a PhD. So what I had to do was actually put the answer in there for AI because they're not about to tell you who it is. Okay, so I put in who was the first American to receive a Prussian PhD, Edward Everett. And it says, yes, Edward Everett was the first American to receive a PhD from a German university, having been awarded his PhD from the University of Göttingen in 1817. Okay, so as we'll get into, it's Edward Everett, Horace Mann, Granville Stanley Hall, and all of these characters who we look at as the founders of Western education, who went over to Prussia after receiving at least a Bachelor of Arts at a state college and learned of this new Prussian way, and then came back, adopted it all into Western education, created what is still, with very little changes, the same education system they created then. So we're close to 200 years of an education system that, according to us, hasn't worked proper, but according to them is humming along just fine. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's how, I just wanted to show you how AI is a little bit funny. They're not really they're gonna beat around the bush. They're not gonna really tell you the true answer until you actually have source material and you provide it and input it in there. AI is gonna most likely steer you away. Okay, so it even says there, Everett later returned to the United States where he held numerous prominent positions, including professor of Greek literature at Harvard. He was the governor of Massachusetts and secretary of state. Okay, so we were talking on the last show, or the first American fascists, we were talking about this honoring of former secretaries of states and secretaries of war with the pictures on the wall, first created out of the Lincoln administration. Okay, so we're also going to get deep into the German historical school now, and so just so everybody knows what the German historical school is, this is really where we have adopted our system from. The German historical school of jurisprudence. So this is about law. This is about the philosophy of law, or the school of thought that goes into it. We talked about sort of the science of it, the scientific management of it, the last episode, and how they applied that to sociological jurisprudence. Jurisprudence meaning system of law. Okay. And it says is a 19th century intellectual movement in the study of German law, and with Romanticism as its background, it conceived of law as the organic expression of a national consciousness, a Volksgeist. It stood in opposition to an earlier movement called rational law. So you can see they're stepping away from rationality, and they are very much like the American progressives, attempting to create a system that moves, that's alive. The American progressives talked about a living law, living system of law to go along with an ever-changing society. Now, when you look at the U.S. Constitution, I've said this many times, it's immovable. Those rights to speak, think, and assemble freely are supposedly innate to the human being. And so we get into natural law, and we start talking about that. You can see that these guys are opposed to natural law. And it says that natural lawyers held that law could be discovered only by rational deduction from the nature of man. Okay, and so they're saying that they're stepping away from this rational law, but what they're really stepping away from is natural law. This law under God or our creator. Okay, and they look to the Volksgeist, the sort of spirit of society, much like they pointed to the society in the West here in the United States and Canada. But generally, wherever there's a Commonwealth, whenever I say West, that's who I'm going to include. So I'm including Australia, Britain, New Zealand, Canada. You know, all of these places are being affected in the same manner, and we see that today too. Okay, so We also see a combination of Roman law, and what we see actually is a combination of Prussian and Roman law. So many times I hear people say all roads lead to Rome, and everything that's happening today can be traced back to Rome. And so we're just sort of verifying that and saying, yeah, you're right. In that, a lot of these guys are experts in Roman law. They have degrees in Roman law, and they become very influential as advisors to world leaders. So back up to Romanticism for a second, because what is Romanticism bringing in here into the system but subjectivity? Okay, so if anybody doesn't understand the difference between subjectivity and objectivity, if you want to really get as close as you can to the truth of something or the truth of a matter, you want objectivity rather than subjectivity, because subjectivity is a perception. It can be looked at from various different angles. So they even talk about it here. The distinction between subjectivity and objectivity is a basic idea of philosophy, particularly epistemology and metaphysics. Various understandings of this distinction have evolved through the work of philosophers over centuries. One basic distinction is something is subjective if it is dependent on minds, such as biases, perception, emotions, opinions, imaginary objects, or conscious experiences. So this is how they capitalize on us right here. Biases, perception, emotions, opinions, and imaginary objects. Okay, this is really the basis of the pseudo-environment that Walter Lippmann had proposed in 1921 with his public opinion. And we see many people living today, just over 100 years after the publication of that piece of literature, living in a pseudo-environment with perceptions, not a perspective, allowing their personal biases, prejudice, stereotypical filters to affect how they see things and how they think. Okay, so that's probably the most important thing that we want to show you today is how to think. Because these guys, everybody that I'm going to show you here today, and everybody that I've ever showed you, understands how to think. All of these elites or oligarchs, the social engineers, the clinicians, they all have a background in the liberal arts, and that allows you to think proper and more clear. And big surprise, that is exactly the knowledge they remove from our education system. I'm sure you heard me say it before. So something is objective if it can be confirmed or assumed independently of any minds. If a claim is true, even when considering it outside the viewpoint of a sentient being, then it may be labeled objectively true. For example, many people would regard 2 + 2 = 4 as an objective statement of mathematics. Good example, because in 1984 they say 2 + 2 = 5. And they pound Winston Smith into the ground. They put a cage on his face and fill it with rats until he says 2 + 2 = 5. And not only did he have to say it, but he had to really believe it. Even after he had said it the first time, they didn't believe him and kept punishing him until they felt that he truly believed that 2 + 2 = 5. So we can see that that is going on in our world right now through this introduction of subjectivity that comes from the Romantic movement or Romanticism. It is the background of the German historical school of jurisprudence. So amazing that we're looking at a system of law that's adopted into America that's based on subjectivity. And then, as we already know from Brandeis Part 6, it's a scientific or social science application. The Brandeis Brief is a collection of data, facts, mathematical modeling, and all of these subjective ways that we can look at things with perceptions and through emotion, right? This is the ameliorating the poor and needy progressive mantra, this radical social reform aspect. It's very emotional and it's very irrational. You don't have to look very far today to see the irrationality of the left, the irrationality of the right. They're both being compromised by progressivism. This is one of the most important things that we can learn here now, is that progressivism has infiltrated both parties. So when I hear people say that they're two wings of the same bird, that is correct, but it is progressivism that unites them. And it is progressivism that infiltrated our mainstream media back in the 1910s, before there was really radio or television. It was just newspaper. And J.P. Morgan famously took over the editorships of all of the most influential newspapers in America, essentially so that they can hide all of the business that they were getting attention for through the newspapers. So they just took control of the news, and they haven't let go since. Okay, so if you think you live in a democracy today, you never have in your whole life. I'm sorry to tell you that. I wouldn't be depressed about it. Just gather that information, move on. Okay, so again, we're going to get into uh, logical systems. So, we talked about subjectivity versus objectivity. There's also inductive versus deductive. And which is better? Well, deductive is far better than inductive. And so why do I say that? Because uh, inductive reasoning can be useful. While inductive reasoning can be useful, it can be prone to be flawed. That's because conclusions drawn using induction go beyond the information contained in the premise. An inductive argument may be highly probable, but even if all the observations are accurate, it can lead to incorrect conclusions still. So deductivity is what we practice here at the History of Propaganda, forensic historical analysis, or investigative journalism. We're using historical method, the collection of primary, secondary source material, and deductively chaining reasoning together, much like the 2 + 2 = 4, to arrive at an amazing conclusion here that the American Progressive era and the American Progressive movement is really the conduit or the vehicle in which the New World Order infiltrated America back in the early 1900s. Okay, so what we see is this system of law in the United States going to inductive. Okay, and Harvard was where they started. And Louis Brandeis was in the first class after they had changed it all. Okay, so it goes back to this Christopher Columbus Langdell character. He was, I'm not sure if he was the dean of Harvard. He was the dean of Harvard Law School, I'm pretty sure, and he overhauled the entire system and made it based on inductivity rather than deductivity. And Brandeis is in the class in the year, the first year that is employed. Okay, so and Brandeis always lauded inductivity. So right there, the basis of our entire philosophy of jurisprudence in America is based on inductivity, subjectivity. So it can be perceived from as many different angles as there are people and opinions. So all of a sudden, we are in a highly manipulable system of law. Okay, and so one of the key guys we got to understand in the bringing together of social sciences in America that we didn't discuss in part 6 is Max Weber. Weber. Maximilian Karl Emil Weber. Okay. So he's a German sociologist, historian, jurist, political economist, who is one of the central figures in the development of sociology and the social sciences more generally. His ideas continue to influence social theory and research for sure. This man, Max Weber, is one of the most influential and cited philosophers of the 20th century. He'll be at the top or near the top of any list that you go and search for most cited or most influential or most important philosophers or economists of the 20th century. Maximilian Karl Emil Weber will be there. Okay, and he learns from these people that we're going to get into today that are a generation prior to him. But he's the author of the Weimar Constitution in the interwar period. He advised the drafting of the Weimar Constitution, and if anybody's familiar with the history of the Weimar, it doesn't end well. Okay, Göttingen, same place that Edward Everett graduated from. So one of these other these key guys to understand, and he comes from the older school of historical method, and he's the guy that's teaching, and it's from his mind comes this thread of philosophy that Max Weber then continues on into more contemporary times. Okay, you can see here that he's a German economist of the historical school of economics, best known as the author of Political Economy from the standpoint of the historical method. So he's really the founder. He's establishing this idea back in the mid-1850s. Nice taught at the University of Heidelberg for over 30 years and was perhaps the most theoretically oriented economist of the older historical school. So like others in the German historical school, Nye disliked the attitudes of classical school, Adam Smith. So we're talking about laissez-faire free market, going back to sort of the natural way of economy, and they're opposed to it. And he helps establish through men like Richard T. Ely, who I have on the cover of the story that we're going to get into here in minutes. You can see that these guys received their PhDs. Richard Theodore Ely was an American economist, author, and leader of the progressive movement. He's one of the most profound leaders of the progressive movement. And he's in our story today. Okay. So we're just going to do a little prologue so that you can be familiar with some of these ideas and philosophies and definition of terms before we get going. And I think without any further ado, we go to Brandeis Part 7, the philosophy of law. And so I've got a picture here of Brandeis and all of his social science cohorts inside of a panopticon, or in front of a city built inside of a panopticon to sort of resemble the world that we live in. We all live except in it. We all live in a prison, except ours is invisible. Okay, but if you ever wanted to sort of draw that out and see what it looks like, we're all living in a panopticon. Okay, and so we're going to get to the founder of the panopticon, Jeremy Bentham, here at the end, and sort of his philosophy on life as we sort of steer towards his philosophy of utilitarianism and the greater good, chasing pleasure and avoiding pain. Do these things sound familiar to you? Because this is largely how our world is built today. Everybody's running around chasing pleasure and avoiding pain. Okay, so on the left here we have Horace Mann, our buddy previously mentioned Edward Everett, Granville Stanley Hall, Edward Allsworth Ross, Howard, Ward, who everybody looks to as the father of the welfare state. We've got 33rd degree Master Mason, head of the Massachusetts Lodge, the most influential lodge in the Western Hemisphere, close personal friends with Louis Brandeis, the Dean of Harvard Law School and Phi Beta Kappa, Nathan Roscoe Pound. Here's our buddy Richard T. Ely, progressive founder. Albion Woodbury Small is somebody we met in the last episode, and he went to Prussia, received his PhD, and came back and opened up a psychology department at the University of Chicago. Wilhelm Wundt, he's got ties to the Illuminati, and all of experimental psychology and really psychology itself goes back to this guy who was teaching structuralist psychology back in the mid-1800s, the second half of the 19th century, and he was teaching all of those that founded our Western education system. And they all came back, created psychology departments at all the leading universities, researching the human being. This is why all the universities now are research universities, not centers for education. Okay, and then on the far right, we have William James, who was a Harvard professor, and at the same time, Wundt is creating experimental psychology at Leipzig. William James is doing the same at Harvard, maybe separated by a couple years, but we're in the late 18th or 1800s. And William James, as most of you will know by now if you've looked at my work, was a mentor to Walter Lippmann at Harvard. Walter Lippmann would go and have tea with James and his wife. And I think that was specifically in Lippmann's post-grad year at Harvard, where he was the assistant to George Santayana. And this is where the political philosopher was born. So we look at Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, people like that are directly identified with U.S. foreign policy. But Walter Lippmann's the first, and he's groomed under William James, George Santayana, who said, those that don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. Lippmann gains his Master of Arts degree. He's a Phi Beta Kappa as well, and he's really looked to as the father of modern journalism today. So if you don't know anything about that, you can go to my it's the House of Truth series at the History of Propaganda. Prophets of Progress, I think it was the one in which we go deep into Lippmann's life. Okay, so we're going to get into how this all influences American or Western progressivism. And so there's sort of an evolution of psychology. At first, they're measuring your skull, measuring body parts, and determining, they're hypothesizing that if you have a big skull, you're smart. So it's the first very rudimentary steps into studying the human being, and that's functionalism, structuralism specifically. They were the first two main fields of early psychology. Functionalism, the study of our purpose, and not just our purpose, but between action and the resulting output. So they would give you stimulus and then watch what you did and then record that information and then use it to apply back to society later to then steer like a ship, like the helmsman of a ship, using the feedback loop originated by Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, and the human use of human beings. Okay, this is an amazing book right here. The human use of human beings. Norbert Wiener, Cybernetics and Society. You see that he's the founder of the feedback loop. He's, according to him and his father, Leo, they are direct descendants of Maimonides. Okay, this is really an incredible book for anybody that's sort of fluent in the cybernetics era. This is probably blowing your mind, but you can go find these books. Go to the local bookstore, try to find a port town if you live near a port town, an international city. Go to an old bookstore if there is any, and you'll start finding these for $5. But these are priceless. Okay. In the memory of my father, Leo Wiener, formerly professor of Slavic languages at Harvard University. And guess what? He's involved with the creation of the inquiry, that group that I showed you at first. Well, Leo Wiener is involved in that because he's the first professor of Slavic languages at all at any American university. And at the same time he's teaching there, his genius son, the most remarkable boy in the world, there's newspaper articles written about him when he was a little boy, was such a genius apparently that he was going to school there at Harvard at the age of 17 while his dad was a professor. Okay. So they're really using, this is prior to Norbert Wiener, but you can see that they're already trying to figure out, if they stimulate us, how do we respond? So it's really, we're just rats in a cage. And they're studying us to figure out how to engineer our direction, to orient us in the direction that they want, to their heart's content, molding us. Sound Fabian? Because they're involved here. And we'll get to it. So William James's functionalism comes after the structuralism. Based in Darwinism, approaches the mind as a functional tool adaptive to external stimulus inherent to our survival instincts. So they are getting right into the deepest of our innate qualities, trying to figure us right out. Here we are 150 years after this or more. We can see that they've poured a lot of money in here and figured out a lot of things. So research-based study of the human being. First attempt at experimental research-based study of the human being. So a large number of American students inspired by Prussian Wissenschaft traveled to Prussia, and the most popular were the social sciences: economics, history, sociology, psychology, archaeology, anthropology. These are all headings under social science or sociology. Wundt knew psychology, an important aspect to the German historical school, which we've sort of been introduced to now. So at least we know what we're talking about a little bit, German historical school. But Wundt knew psychology was an important aspect to it, which served as a tool to transfer culture from the old to the new world. So we see a transferring of German Prussian culture from the old world to the new world. And this is talked about in the book, German Historical School and American Scholarship, a study in the transfer of culture by Jürgen Herbst. And he's a professor emeritus of educational policy studies and history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Wesleyan University. He's educated at Harvard. And just so you know, the Brandeis landed in Madison when they first arrived in the United States. It was one of their preferred spots. So we can start to see why the University of Wisconsin holds so many papers of these people. So the older school of the historical philosophy is the mid-1800s, dominated by the pioneering founders of it: Karl Nys, Wilhelm Roscher, and Hugo Hildebrandt. The younger school was the second group, influential during the mid to late 1800s. Key leaders were Gustav von Schmoller and Adolf Wagner. The youngest school is where we find Max Weber. It's the late 1800s. So he sort of straddles the century. He's a more contemporary economist or philosopher. Weber central in the development of the social sciences during the last century and a direct descendant of the German historical school of philosophy. It's sourced. You can check the bottom as we will at the end. So professors of all three eras considered strong supporters of state socialism. So they're concerned mainly with Prussian national social policy reform. And so this is what is happening today. National social policy reform. Right now, as we speak, a progressive national social policy reform. So this philosophy emanating from much heralded and respected at the time German universities at Göttingen, Berlin, Leipzig, Heidelberg, Freiburg, Halle, Tübingen, Bonn, and Munich. Professors of all three schools considered strong supporters of state socialism, or centralized state, and all of us being of good utility to support the power of the state. They start to sound a lot like Mussolini, the American Progressives, and the Fabians. And there's a reason for that, is because it's all a common thread. All of these guys have the same ends. They may be arguing over the ways and means, but the ends, total global control, is the common denominator that binds them. So, as revealed in Brandeis Part 6, The Science of Law, the founders of sociology, nearly to a man, following the completion of a liberal arts degree in the U.S., attended prestigious German universities, receiving PhDs under eminent German liberal professors, or progressives, in the latter half of the 19th century, and then returned to America to pioneer the founding of the entire academic field of sociology, or what they called then the social sciences, because it was originally sociology. By the time they come over to America, they call it social sciences. So we showed how these founders then joined with Nathan Roscoe Pound in combining their social science with a new philosophy of law, founding our modern sociological jurisprudence. And Brandeis was the great practitioner of the new law. So this is why in this story, we're not going to talk a lot about Brandeis, but he is the great practitioner of it. And it's the Brandeis Brief that's really the main tool. And it's still called the Brandeis Brief today. And it's still credited with being the very first brief of that type that completely altered our system of law from there on afterward. Okay, so hopefully you guys are all following along so far. This all makes sense. So in this study, we consider the philosophical influences of Prussian German intellectuals, mostly from the German historical school, on the founding of not just our Western K through 12 education system, but the fields of American psychology, or the fields of American sociology, psychology, psychiatry, economics, and history, and in doing so, forming the general philosophy of social science as a system of law in America. So there's our buddy Edward Everett with his hand hidden, and he is indeed a Freemason. So the case investigated here is the rise and decline of the German Historical School of Social Science in the United States between the founding of the Johns Hopkins University in 1876, which is a direct bloodline almost back to Prussia, as is Chicago University, first established by Rockefeller, a Baptist university turned into a research university, and the outbreak of war in Europe in 1914. So it's basically overlapping with the progressive era of 1890 to 1920 that I'm describing here. So by the German Historical School of Social Science in America, I mean those men in the university departments of history, political science, economics, and sociology who had been trained in Germany and who regarded themselves as disciples of the German Historical School. My concern has been with what these scholars discovered in Germany that they deemed worthy of introduction into American higher education. So this is from an author that is questioning sort of the validity of it all. And it's from German Historical School and American Scholarship, Jürgen Herbst. So he's questioning the efficacy or the morality, the ethics of whatever it is that they found so appealing in Germany, and whether it was right to bring it to the West. So the founders of nothing less than the entire Western education system itself, Edward Everett, Phi Beta Kappa, the very first American PhD, as we've shown earlier, president of Harvard and Secretary of State, along with the very father of American education, Horace Mann, were both instrumental in implementing the Prussian model into the U.S. through Massachusetts, New York, and Michigan in the 1830s. Mann, through his appointment as Secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837, began adoption of the Prussian model into America. I've got actual documents proving this. An underlying fundamental framework of general education needed to be laid down first before the application of many layers of social sciences. Mann making mandatory universal education for all. Free education, universal education, with the admitted intention of creating a universal group mind. This comes straight from Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Humboldt, where they say that they want to remove the free will of the student in the soil, and that is the main objective of our education system, is to remove our free will in the soil before we sprout. This is the words that they use. So we can see it in the timeline. There was needed, before anything else, an underlying fundamental framework of general education for all, no matter sex, creed, or character, before they could then apply the main layered social sciences. Mann making mandatory universal education for all, starting in Massachusetts in 1852, exactly 50 years before John D. Rockefeller's General Education Board established the Prussian model across the United States. And so the General Education Board is the predecessor to Rockefeller Foundation. Now, some people may balk at that, but that is absolutely true. You can find it on their own website. They'll even make those associations that the General Education Board, first chartered in 1902, is the predecessor to the Rockefeller Foundation, and it is the General Education Board that establishes our Western education system. There is no doubt about that. So it may come as a surprise to you, but like we learned in deductivity, it doesn't matter what you think about it, the truth still stands. And oftentimes, the more incredulous you are, the more ignorant you are of these things. Okay, so Edward Everett, 15th governor of Massachusetts, when Mann was head of Massachusetts School Board. So these two Freemasons line up. They team up to create our Western education system. He was an expert in Roman law, met personally with Wilhelm von Humboldt. This is what they all did. They went over to learn, but they wanted to also witness it and see how the fruits of the labor were being affected in society, and they were beyond pleased. And I've got letters that they wrote as part of congressional record, which they applauded this Prussian system, demanded that it comes to the West. And sure as shit, that's exactly what happened. Okay, so the Humboldtian educational ideal is the Prussian education model borrowed into America. In 1817, Everett graduated Göttingen, becoming the first American to receive a PhD. So Carl Nice, we've talked about him a little bit. Looks like a reasonable man. He's the founder of the German Historical School and author of the most consequent methodological reflection in the German Historical School. He wrote the book Political Economy from the Viewpoint of Historical Method. Around the same time that the Western education model was being introduced by Horace Mann and Edward Everett. So Nice taught at Freiburg in 1855 before moving to Heidelberg in 65 to teach general economic theory, public finance, and applied economics and economic policy. So he's really, some of the first social scientists, in whose path the inquiry later follows. So Nye, heavily influenced by Bruno Hildebrandt, another founder of the historical school, who also, as fits the pattern, founded the first statistical office in Bern and Thuringia, and the necessary concomitant, the Journal of Economics and Statistics. So this movement to a scientific governance of society starts in the 1700s with the census. The collection of data of human behavior is what the census is. It's the basis of all of it. This is how the first rudimentary steps is the census in Sweden and Prussia. And it's all about statistics, data, mathematical modeling, right? This is what they do to determine that global warming is now called climate change and that we're all climate deniers when not one of us denies that there's actually a climate. We just completely deny that money is going to stop it, or we need to be taxed more to lower the temperature of the earth, something that they are synthetically creating, fabricating whole cloth while denying us the history, right? This is sort of the main method of operation for the progressives. We're always going to look forward. We're never looking back. So when you look at Kamala Harris's presidential campaign slogan just passing, it was, we're never going back. So build back better, we're never going back. Hillary Clinton's forward together, Obama's hope and change, the Bush's war on terror. It's all progressive. Because progressivism's three main tenets are efficiency, military preparedness, and trust the science. So military preparedness is against any external threat. It could be a terrorist, it could be a virus, it could be a military, it could be a country, it can be a person. It can be a lone gunman. It can be anything. And so we see that we are surrounded, at least we're told that we are surrounded by external threats, whether domestic or international. And it keeps us in this emotive state of fear that they got into our brains with all this studying, figured out that we don't think well when we're in fear. So I implore you to get out of fear. If you feel anxiety, that is fear of the future. You got to stay out of fear of the future narratives and look what they're doing to us narratives. Get focused. So along with Francis Lieber and Edward René de Labouille, Johann Caspar Bluntschli codified the very first modern standards of international law and war. This is important because along with this progressive movement is this move towards international law. And Bluntschli is one of the first to ever codify these ideas. So Bluntschli, writing A General Theory of State in 1851, Bluntschli was a Freemason, Master of Lodge, whatever that is. Bluntschli also one of the founders of the Institute of International Law. So we're starting to make this idea of international law an institution. Today, the organization is considered the most authoritative world Academy of International Law. So Gustav Ratzenhofer was the president of the High Military Court in Vienna, wrote on military law, and advocated the philosophies of Herbert Spencer, Charles Darwin, and Auguste Comte. Has created what he described as a positive monism. His work centered on the evolutionary aspects of human associations, reduced social phenomena to the physical, chemical, and biological, and located man's fundamental drives in his biological nature. So Gustav von Schmoller, known in Germany primarily as a social reformer, taught both pioneering American economists Richard T. Ely and Edward Seligman, and founding American sociologist Albion Woodbury Small, as well as the outspoken American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. Seligman, a founder of the American Economic Association and the American Association of University Professors. So we talk about the Association of American Universities, and this system of American universities, and then the Association of American State Colleges, and then the Association of American University Professors. These systems to create peer review and the illusion of consensus are all established here. They're learning from these guys, their forefathers, that have already gone through it. They understood how to manipulate society to create radical social reform. Seligman, with the assistance of E.A. Ross, Edward Allsworth Ross, were responsible for America's first progressive income tax. And so Brandeis is involved in applying the first progressive graduated income tax in 1913 as part of the New Freedom campaign. So Wilhelm Wundt, we sort of discussed him as a connection to the Illuminati. He's considered the father of experimental psychology or scientific psychology. He's a leader in the new psychology of Prussia. He founded the first experimental psychology laboratory at Leipzig around the time William James was doing the same at Harvard. Wundt, awarding the first ever PhDs to foreigners to a number of American pioneers of Western education and the social sciences. Both Richard T. Ely and James McKean Cattell, pioneers in psychology and economics respectively, were taught by Wilhelm Wundt. James McKean Cattell actually did postgraduate assistant work with Wilhelm Wundt, worked beside him for an entire year, and then he came over, basically a direct disciple of Wilhelm Wundt. We'll see sort of that tree that comes up. Okay, so other notable students of Wundt's experimental laboratories include pioneers in psychology, psychiatry, and sociology: James Mark Baldwin, Emil Durkheim, Granville Stanley Hall, Walter Dill Scott, Leitner Whitmer, Charles Hubbard Judd, August Kirschman, George Herbert Mead, Hugo Munsterberg, Edward Titchener, and Wilhelm Wirth. In all, Wundt awarded 18 PhDs to American educators. They all came back to America and established their own psychology departments at Western universities. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, all of them. So from the American Sociological Review, page 458, we see this tree that they've created. And it's all from Wilhelm Wundt, directly back to the Illuminati here. And then we've got different trees here, starting once down here with Granville Stanley Hall. You can see he's got his own mini tree, as does William James. These names here are very famous to anybody that's done any research or investigation into the creation of experimental psychology here in the West. Watson, Thorndike. Watson's the guy that holds knives and hammers over the heads of babies to see if babies inherently have fear of these objects. Just the Skinner box, B.F. Skinner puts his child in a box, keeps them in there to see sort of how they respond. Okay, Albion Woodbury Small is here. You can see that the dates go across from left to right, 1850, 1860, 1870. And as we turn into the 20th century here, some of these names are familiar, more contemporary. And Jastrow, he's worth investigating, as is L.M. Terman. Why? Because L.M. Terman's son invents Silicon Valley. So the vast majority of men on the facing page, eugenicists, followers of Herbert Spencer's survival of the fittest and social Darwinism, followers of experimental psychology as a general industry-wide philosophy. Jastro's wife, the sister of the founder of Hadassah, Henrietta Zold, and Henrietta's husband, can't remember his first name, but he founds the Palestine Economic Corporation with Brandeis in bringing the first settlements to Palestine. His wife is busy too. And Thorndike inspires Watson, Pavlov, and B.F. Skinner. These are founders of experimental psychology. And here is how this ominous continuity of psychology flows and evolves to today. So the first ones, as we stated, were the structuralists, Wilhelm Wundt out of Leipzig, Edward B. Titchener. Okay, and that evolves into William James's functionalism as it comes across the Atlantic into our Western world. It evolves into psychodynamics, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and into behaviorism. So this is some of the stuff that a lot of you will be very familiar with, is the behaviorists. B.F. Skinner, how he used animals, pigeons, cats, dogs, and a lot of these guys using insects to then apply what they find in their behavior to human beings. And so many people thinking that humans are animals, but that's a misnomer. It's false science. It's a pseudoscience to believe that we are animals. But why do we think this? Because Darwin told us we come from apes. A necessary aspect of progressivism. So the biological sociology is largely beginning with Darwin's theory of evolution as it relates to the animal kingdom and the Herbert Spencer's appropriation of Darwin's theories upon that of the human being, to the larger idea of society in general. Because human relations are bound together in marvelous complexity, parallels were being drawn to the similarly complex biological relations being presented in Darwin's theory of evolution. What if these biological relations should turn out to be the pattern of human relations? And they just machinated that into reality. So the social sciences brought into unity once abstract and disconnected studies of the human experience into a cohesive, interdisciplinary, nearly living organism. Small stating that a network of causes and effects weaves the life of men through the ages and around the world into a connected whole, that is human experience throughout its length and breadth is a unity. So according to Small, this new knowledge did not deserve to be ranked as a science of human experience unless it mirrored the interconnectedness and reciprocal influences of which we find real life to be composed. Here we see the very earliest conceptions later expanded on during the Macy conferences, the early thoughts of interdisciplinary crossover of knowledge between the sciences to better understand the human condition. So the Macy conferences, the first meetings were on hypnotism. Okay, and that turns into the MK Ultra program of the 50s. But prior to that, the Macy conferences are in the 30s, 40s. And I've got some incredible literature on that. So Ross Ashby is a key guy, a Britain personality that sort of takes Tavistock and brings it west through this MK Ultra. Okay, so an introduction to cybernetics, W. Ross Ashby is one of our sources. And then this book. It is just absolutely incredible. It holds the minutes of these early Macy conferences. You can see how thick it is. And this is sort of the background of the Future Perfect articles. Cybernetics, the Macy conferences, 46 to 53, goes through the minutes of all those early meetings and what they were doing. And so that's a picture of Shannon's mouse box, okay, with doors that open and things. If you get into that, you can start to see what I'm talking about. But go to the Future Perfect articles, although you can't because that website is shut down. But soon enough, I'll be doing those future perfect articles and getting them into the history of propaganda. So that's the creation of the League of Nations and sort of the evolving out of the efficiency movement, progressive era into the technocracy, into the MK Ultra. Because everything starts in the progressive era under the progressive movement. Okay. So the first ever common school or normal school here in the West, built by Horace Mann and Edward Everett in this new system, still stands today in Massachusetts. And if you look at the front entrance, we can see a square and compass. So the Masonic influence here, very obvious. Okay, stripped architecture, the preferred architecture of the totalitarian, Stalin, Mussolini, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, go look it up. Starved architecture or stripped architecture. So more than any other American sociologist, Albion Woodbury Small has mediated to us the results of European scholarship. The intellectual world is now one society. No nation would have had anything approaching its present scientific development without the collaboration of the scientists of different nations. Indeed, a science as a national phenomenon is unthinkable. It is part of the life of the great society. So there he's using the term that Graham Wallace would use in writing his book, The Great Society, in 1914 or 1913. And he dedicated that book to Walter Lippmann, his close personal friend. Walter Lippmann, a member of the Fabian Society and the Rhodes Roundtable. And in addition to that, LBJ's presidential campaign slogan was called The Great Society. And according to legend, this is speculation, I haven't been able to back this, but I've heard this from several places, that when they buried JFK at Arlington, and LBJ was there, after they had buried JFK and left the funeral, the first stop was an unscheduled visit at the house of Walter Lippmann. And then you see LBJ's political campaign slogan, The Great Society. And then, at Haight-Ashbury at the same time in the 60s, a lot of these bands that came out, they were called The Great Society. There was many bands, they said, that used that name. Okay. So while sociology as developed by men like Small and Ward and Giddings and Ross was largely a protest against individualism of the type suggested by the phrases laissez-faire and every man for himself, it has been said that the meetings of the American Economic Association held in Philadelphia in 1917, including a joint session with the American Sociological Society, or ASS, celebrated the funeral obsequies of the doctrine of laissez-faire. So this is the funeral of laissez-faire, free market. This is what they are doing. They are killing the individual at Paris Peace Conference 1919, but here they are giving him another blow by removing laissez-faire free market, much like they're trying to remove cash, when cash actually is empowering because you don't have to necessarily admit to the government at tax time any of that. So it empowers the individual, and that's why they want it gone. The gun empowers the individual. That's why they want it gone. This information empowers the individual. This is why they don't want you to know about it. So it would hardly be too much to say that during the first decades of Professor Small's connection with the University of Chicago, that doctrine was the summary and conclusion of economic teaching as presented by the majority of its professors in the United States. So the Cameralists were practitioners of the German science of public administration of the 18th and early 19th century Prussia and Sweden. They were the pioneers in economic, environmental, and administrative knowledge and technology, centralization of the state through the collection and interpretation of statistical and quantitative data for long-term economic state planning. These are the Cameralists. These are council or advisors, a group of intelligence that surround the leader, the king, the prime minister, the president, much like the inquiry did with Woodrow Wilson. They are experts in their field, and they are all independently in different fields, entering wedges, becoming social influencers. So it was the science of good government born out of the Renaissance, combining the utilitarian agenda of enlightened absolutism with these new ideas in the social sciences. To make efficient the state's ability to draw from its labor, to harness our labor efficiently. So the idea of statecraft is born, efficiency of state, preparedness against threats of neighboring countries, to make everyone a utility of the state, to use each and every citizen in a pragmatic means to an end, the ultimate in disrespect. And that's the very definition of using somebody. When you look at somebody as a means to your end, you're using them. So we're looking to have win-win relationships here. Right? We enter only into win-win relationships where we both benefit. So John Dewey's a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. He's a major leader of progressivism. He's one of the most well-known progressive reformers of the era and one of the most prominent members of the experimental school of psychology of the 20th century. He's Phi Beta Kappa, Johns Hopkins. Dewey founds the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools. Okay. Dewey's progressive education ideas combined with Horace Mann's Masonic developed normal school system and the whole language approach, while highly contentious when implemented, still very much around today and found in state standard initiatives like Common Core or products like Hooked on Phonics. So the masses, motivated by nice sounding catchphrases and the promised improvement of education through increased standardization, and as of 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the next No Child Left Behind, as the progressive standard of education in America continues to move forward. So no matter who is president, the progressive wheels turn unabated because, while it may not be living up to the expectations of the general public, to these admitted social engineers, this progressive perpetual motion machine has been running just fine, thank you very much, for well over 100 years. So you can see how they travel to Prussia post-grad, where they are then taught the methods used during the Prussian Reformation to then change American society upon return by creating their own laboratories and establishing the first networks with which each other they become the political philosopher, the thought leader, the entering wedge. Their primary goal is persuasion. This is a delicate, dark art, using their position, their influence, their authority to fan the radical winds of social change, with each positioned at their assigned node within the larger distributive network connecting the nation. So this is how they create consensus. These periodicals that circulate between them and all of these universities. They start to establish this idea of scientific governance and the appeal to the expert, the appeal to authority, the argumentum ad auctoritatem, the two-step flow of communication that we've talked about. So the invention of the social science is absolutely critical in that it enabled those social engineers to study, gather, and compute information, and then from that derive their next steps in enacting change in behaviors through applied science and more observation. The giant feedback loop acting as the social engine to a larger progressive wheel turning. Okay, so just wanted to touch base here with the Metaphysical Club, Oliver Wendell Holmes, William James, Charles Peirce, John Dewey. Those are all considered members of the Metaphysical Club. And this is the introduction of philosophy into the United States. Prior to that, there was really no philosophy. So Metaphysical Club, it is written by Louis Menand. Louis Menand is the keynote speaker at the Walter Lippmann 2022 conference, where they identified the crisis of the expert, and they were wondering what the next thing was to do. Well, they have Louis Menand be the keynote speaker. Okay, so move on to Auguste Comte's Positivism, The Meaning of Social Science by Albion Woodbury Small there shown. Just to show you there's some literature there. We've gone through a lot of that in part 6. So early attempts to interpret the unique unity of human experience may be reduced to three species: the sentimental, the mathematical, and the biological. The sentimental species of sociologists range from Fourier, with his harmony of the human passions and his scheme of standardizing human society in blocks of 1,600 persons, and Robert Owen, with his cooperative factories, mathematical sociologists typified by Auguste Comte. So I've got consumers, the Consumers as Cooperative Movement, written by Sidney Webb. These are some of our sources. We ain't messing around. The Consumers of Operative, written by Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Okay. It's an old book. I'm not sure what year it was published, but I want to be careful with the pages because it's an old one. It doesn't have it. Oh, 1921. 1921. So it's an over 100-year-old book that I have in my hands here, written by Sidney and Beatrice Webb on the Consumers as Cooperative Movement. So Comte thought of the universe and all it contained as a unity of two complementary systems of mechanism, namely celestial physics and terrestrial physics. Human life in his rendering was a vast machine. Social sciences to Comte was a technology of social machinery, a handbook of the social forces, soulless forces which turned the wheels of the ages. That is Nathan Roscoe Pound. I think I have that quote in here a second time somewhere. So the universal reciprocity between the parts of human experience which makes life some sort of system of interconnectedness. So they're just talking about, I'm highlighting the language that they're using, universal reciprocity. So in common with sociology, sociological jurisprudence has its origin in the positivist philosophers in the sense that each subject has a continuous development from Comte's positive philosophy. So why is this important? Because Auguste Comte's positivism is that aspect of things like climate change that don't allow us to ask questions. We're always moving forward. This is the Auguste Comte positivism. We're really positive of where we are going. The ends will be perfect. Don't worry about what we're doing now. Don't complain about our ways and means, because the end will be a utopia and nobody will complain because the future is already perfect. So he names Henri de Saint-Simon, one of the founding utopian socialists, and he studied directly under him the scientific study of society was what Comte referred to as the religion of humanity. He named sociology the queen of all sciences and its practitioners scientists, priests. So you talk about how science has turned into a religion. So Roscoe Pound describing Comte's social philosophy as a technology of social machinery, a handbook representing the wheels of ages being turned by soulless forces. So we talk about the cremation of care at the Bohemian Grove. We talk about clinicians being disinterested and soulless in their evaluation and investigation into the human being. The wheels of ages imply that this is progressive and always moving forward. And he establishes the technology of social machinery, a handbook of how to engineer society. This name here, interesting, Xavier, is probably a Jesuit. So Comte's positivism developed as an answer to the social disorder resulting from the French Revolution or the Prussian Reformation or the Napoleonic Wars specifically. So also found fertile ground with the founders of pragmatism, William James and Charles Sanders Peirce, and with progressive federal government administrators like Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Croly, and Lester Frank Ward. Because pragmatism is really about the ends, not the ways and means again. Pragmatism says that if it works, therefore it is good. Doesn't matter how you got there. So it's here we begin to see now the first signs of real social transformation away from the farm and homestead to the steel cityscapes of our industrial modern world, factories and machines turning wheels, forging guns and swords from plowshares, and the stainless steel promise of a new American dream. Herbert Crowley writes The Promise of American Life, and that's the Progressive Manifesto, 1909. So the wheels of progress that turn our world being fired up deliberately like magnets being spun inside a matrix of copper wire, and the rotation of society so necessary to Comte's vision. This is how electricity is born, by spinning magnets inside of a coil or a matrix of copper. You see that this is how they are trying to harness our energy. And Comte believed that social control would be made possible only after Darwin's idea of human evolution was first established. The natural world must be comprehended before they could study and apply workable solutions. Whether it was natural law or laws of nature, they were here to master all things natural. They all detest natural law. They all detest human nature. They all detest nature. They look at it as chaos, so opposite of the way we look at it. So, quick side note here, the background image drawn by Joseph Ramey, a depiction of Union College in Schenectady, New Jersey. The Union College, a liberal arts institution, so be a community college, and it is generally said that it is the second oldest institution of higher learning in the United States behind King's College, Columbia University. Although, when you go and look and investigate for yourself, Harvard founded 1636. William and Mary, where Phi Beta Kappa comes from, 1693. And Yale, where Skull and Bones is founded, as an answer to Phi Beta Kappa, 1701. Not only predate both King's and Union colleges, but predate the founding of America itself. So that kind of tells you that this move to a scientific governance of society was happening. And this is what America was really based on. The founding of America was based on that. So it has been said that Comte's sociology was a technology of social machinery, a handbook of the soulless forces which turned the wheels of ages. That is Nathan Roscoe Pound writing that. So Comte, most remembered as a mathematician, which should help one better understand how law operates in society today. Our modern times defined by mathematical modeling, artificial intelligence, and facial recognition concepts first conceived nearly 200 years ago in the wildest dreams of men like Comte, Bentham, Saint-Simon, Sidney, and Beatrice Webb. A plan of social control now well into the 21st century, nearing completion. Into the foreground steps nothing less than the fullest realization of the welfare state, and we living today have been afforded the hindsight necessary for a critical judgment of actions taken over 100 years ago. We agree with Josephine Goldmark. Those who come after are those who do bear truest witness. We are those with the final say. We are their children of the future, I say, because this is the phrase that they use to justify this radical social change, that the children of the future will live better lives. And so we live here today, those breathing and watching this, in a unique epoch of human historical time, and that we are both the witnesses to this program, and we're able to see the conclusions and sort of what is developed from those ideas from over 100 years ago. So we can bear witness and make final judgment. And not many generations have had that ability to do so. Okay, so men's minds were fascinated in the idea of laws mathematically demonstrable, which controlled the operations of nature, and for a season they took, as it were, a mathematical view. They sought to find mathematical or mechanical laws according to which all things came into existence and were governed in their course of existence. This type of thinking is to be seen in the first positive philosophies of law and in the first stage of sociological jurisprudence. So turning next to sociological components of Pound's jurisprudence, it is widely recognized that they were derived largely from the writings of Lester Frank Ward, Albion Woodbury Small, and most especially Edward Allsworth Ross, who was a colleague of Pound's at the University of Nebraska during 1901 to 1906. Ward was an ardent advocate of government control and social planning who believed that legislation would contribute to the organization of human experience. This is why Brandeis is so important, because not only is he one of the key legislators of all of these ideas into reality, into law, through the National Consumers League, the Brandeis Brief, being funded by Skull and Bones. He's also considered a prophet of regulation. And this is another article that I'm going to get into that's already written that I have on that site. It's very profound, but they identify 4 people as the prophets of regulation of the 20th century: Charles Francis Adams, Louis D. Brandeis, James M. Landis, Alfred E. Kahn. And truth be told, that James M. Landis is a clerk of Brandeis. And this clerk system we've gone over with Louis Brandeis, grooming 21 Jewish lawyers, including Dean Acheson, who I'm not sure is Jewish, but he is one of these clerks that Brandeis teaches. So they're Brandeisian, and they help establish the Brandeisian ideas and further them into the 21st century. James M. Landis is an important guy. He's considered one of the 4 prophets of regulation, but he learned everything he knew under Brandeis. So Brandeis is even more influential. Okay. Prophets of Regulation, written by Thomas K. McCraw, 1984. This is the first printing. I like first printings because then you know nothing has really changed. They haven't altered or added or taken away. So to finish that sentence or that paragraph, similarly, Small assumed that social reform could be carried out through legal means. Due to the influence of these 2 men, Pound approached the law as a form of social engineering. We've covered this in part 6. Indeed, the idea of law as an instrument of engineering and social control at all levels of government is an integral part of Pound's sociological jurisprudence. So Brandeis looked at the creation of the Federal Reserve from a social engineering perspective. And if we've got enough time here today, I'll show you that at the end. So a close friend of Pound's, fellow Harvard law professor Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., was an advocate of legal positivism, the application of Comte's ideas into our legal system. Holmes's prediction of law theory was a key component to his jurisprudential philosophy. Holmes carrying on Comte's tradition, believing law should be predictive. Holmes Jr., opposed to natural law, stated that men make their own laws, that these laws do not flow from some mysterious omnipresence in the sky, and that judges are not independent mouthpieces of the infinite. So they're stepping away from natural law. You can see the distaste, almost hatred that they have for this. So Comte stating the same in French: savoir pour pouvoir et pouvoir pour pouvoir, or to know in order to predict and foresee in order to be able. So this is Minority Report. Anybody watch that movie in the 90s? This was really the wet dream of all of these guys. Over 100 years ago was crime prediction. To stop recidivism. To stop the recommitment of crime. To identify those most to identify those people in society that are most susceptible to crime, most likely to commit crimes. So we see that's unfolding today, right now. So the sociological movement, remembered for the crucial ideological support it gave the progressive criticism of the courts and to the expansion of state intervention in the economy. So this is the growth of the state. Now this cybernetics, they talk about this push and pull that's gone on throughout history between the conscious and the unconscious, the state versus the individual. And, you know, the trivium in the liberal arts has played the fulcrum in that back and forth. If we uncover the trivium, this grammar, logic, rhetoric, and start to communicate properly and more powerfully and more persuasively and attractive, all of a sudden we start to take some of our power back. And at the same time, the power of the state dwindles, and vice versa. If we don't have the trivium and the ability to speak clearly to each other and communicate proper ideas and chain reasoning together, well, the state over, gets one over on us by exploiting our ignorances. So law reigns supreme as the most specialized and highly finished engine of control employed by society. That's from Social Control, a survey of the foundations of order. I think that is Edward Allsworth Ross, or it could be Nathan Roscoe Pound. So, to conclude here today, we're going to get into a man named Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism and the founder of the panopticon. They kept this guy's body hermetically sealed inside a container, and up until about 10 years ago, you could go to a place, I'm not sure where it is, but you could go see his body still sort of taxidermed. But it started to rot. So they took the head off. I'll show you a picture of that in a bit, just to warn you. So just as Pound's sociological jurisprudence was the next step within a long line of continuous development emerging from Comte's positivism, so too we can say that Comte's study of society was largely derived from Jeremy Bentham and the larger and longer historical philosophy of utilitarianism, a pragmatic theory of society that determines right from wrong from outcomes. So what are we talking? Ends and means. Ways and means to an ends. Okay, so the ultimate in using people. Pragmatic approach. And holds that the most ethical moral choice is the one that will produce the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. The greater good. Anybody heard that phrase before? The greater good? When did we hear that phrase? Underneath a totalitarian lockdown. So here again, we have large philosophical ideas asking us to focus on the ends and to ignore the means, to look over here rather than over there, to look at an image, a pseudo-reality rather than the real thing, the effective environment. Like many of the others in this study, Bentham referred to natural law as nonsense, claiming that there existed no rights without the existence of government. Government means to control the mind, and that since natural rights do not emanate from government itself, they are by definition illegitimate. So as long as the government hasn't established the law, then they are illegitimate. It's just a figment of your imagination, natural law. So how the conception of politics changed in England can be traced through the lives and works of four writers: David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Beatrice Webb. Now, David Hume and Jeremy Bentham sort of share that title as founders of utilitarianism, but more predominantly they point to Bentham. John Stuart Mill, one of the founders of our modern day social contract, one of the founders of liberalism, wrote in his book On Liberty that the future society needed necessarily one party of progress, one party of order, and then they were going to pit those against each other under hostile banners and have them create order out of that chaos. Does that sound familiar? Beatrice Webb is included in there as this ominous continuity of socialist thought, from the utopians to the ethical socialists. And it's all about total government control over society, socialism, where we're all equal, which is an impossibility. So each represents a distinctive way of looking at politics, which has become intertwined with others and obscured in political practice, and yet remains a vital part of the political traditions in England. Nevertheless, each writer contributed to a transformed outlook on the nature of politics. It was first suggested by Bentham, its shape was defined by Mill, and the finished product appears in the work of Beatrice Webb and the Fabians, molding the world closer to their heart's desire by putting the earth on an anvil and hitting it to death with two sledgehammers. If anybody's familiar with the Shaw window or our work, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So what makes the differences among the four writers especially impressive is that in a way they all owe allegiance to the same intellectual tradition. The name utilitarian most readily comes to mind. They have all been called utilitarians, and they themselves have claimed some such kinship with one another. Bentham said he had discovered the idea of utility in Hume. Mill, who first made utilitarianism a popular name, was tutored by Bentham himself. as well as by Bentham's chief disciple, James Mill, who is John Stuart Mill's father. And the Webbs often like to describe themselves and other Fabians as latter-day utilitarians. In fact, the name is misleading because it suggests that they all shared a common philosophy, but it does point to certain common sympathies. All these writers praised a common sense, matter-of-fact, concrete, experimental approach to human affairs. Now, if you've read the book Fabian Freeway, they go deep into that and show that there's definitely an ominous continuity between all of these socialists. And, the Fabian Society turns into the British Labour Party. So it's not like they're fringe. It's one of the most powerful political parties on the planet. And that's from The Pursuit of Certainty, Shirley Robin Letwin, University of Chicago, London School of Economics. She was a student of Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek is one of the coiners of the term neoliberalism, where he, von Mises, Walter Lippmann, all congregated in Paris in 1938 to coin the term neoliberalism. Okay, so because this is really a flipping of the definition of liberalism from classic to neo, from somebody that wants to stay out of foreign entanglements, wants to stay out of the business of their neighbors, this classic liberal, the freedom to speak and think and assemble freely, and to not be not to be disrupted, allowed to follow and pursue happiness, right? To this neoliberal, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, progressive radical reform through fear. Okay, so there isn't really any Nazis taking over the world or the United States like they like to think, or none of these people understand the origins of fascism actually are in the American Progressive movement in the 1910s, before Mussolini, a generation prior to Hitler. It's American progressives like Brandeis, Stimson, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Elihu Root, Richard Washburn Child, who teach Mussolini how fascism works. So there's an undeniable continuity of form and function connecting Bentham to Comte, Henri Saint-Simon, and the Utopian socialists in the early 19th century to the ethical socialist movement led by the British Fabians and American Progressives. History shows Roscoe Pound, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Louis D. Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter as an extension of Bentham's panopticon and his utilitarian approach to social control. Brandeis and Frankfurter are heavy government counsel. They are lawyers for the state as an extension of Bentham's panopticon and his utilitarian approach to social control. The early answers to recidivism were mechanical and crude, paralleling the early structuralist attempts at experimental psychology, both under William James at Harvard and Wilhelm Wundt at Leipzig. So their only answer, given the resources at the time, was to remove the offenders from society and have as a main exercise of their detainment rehabilitation with possibility of reintegration. This is really the concept of the jail, right? Putting people in this panopticon. The prison. Okay, so from Harvard Law Review, Sociological Jurisprudence, its scope and purpose by Roscoe Pound. The problem is not merely how lawmaking and law administering functions are exercised, but also how they may be exercised so as best to achieve their purpose, and what conception of these functions by those who perform them will conduce best thereto. So it's about results, outcomes. How do they get best results? And this is inductive because they have a hypothesis and then they're going to try to create it. So here, certainly the pragmatic criterion is sound, and of course it is because pragmatism is inductive. So it's a good match, and it's subjective. So the true juristic theory, the true juristic method is the one that brings forth good works. That is the definition of pragmatism. So it's the idea behind the penitentiary. I mean, when you look at the founders of our Western K through 12 education system in Germany, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Humboldt, of who we've talked about earlier, they said that this new education model was going to be the end of poverty and the end of the penitentiary. So how's that going? Okay, so as we near the end here, we're going to talk about the hedonic calculator. So if many of you have noticed that a lot of people, especially the asleep, spend their weekends chasing pleasure, getting on the boat, going out on the lake, grabbing their skis, going to the mountain, filling their off time with as much pleasure as they can. And certainly they are all avoiding the pain of their responsibility and duty within a free and open society, of taking responsibility for their beliefs and actions, right? But why do they do that? Because they're leaning on the scientific technical expert. This is what they say all the time. I would rather believe somebody with a PhD than somebody in the basement on the internet. Well, it's not about that. It's about the power of your sources. So when you get into the historical method, they start talking about how the level of sources is categorized. You know, eyewitness account, primary source, secondary source, tertiary source, historical artifacts you can hold in your hand. Those are all deductive. So by utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. If that party be the community in general, then the happiness of the community. If a particular individual, then the happiness of that individual. And that is from Jeremy Bentham, page 2, an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. So he goes on about pleasures, breaks it into categories of how we must determine our decisions and the things that we want to do by this hedonic calculus of chasing pleasure and avoiding pain. So pleasures then and the avoidance of pains are the ends which the legislature or the legislator has in view. It behooves him therefore to understand their value. Pleasures and pains are the instruments he has to work with. It behooves him therefore to understand their force, which is again, in other words, their value. So to a person, to an individual considered by himself, the value of a pleasure or pain considered itself will be greater or less according to the four following circumstances. Now, this is directly out of an introduction to principles of morals and legislation. This is the guy that establishes utilitarianism and the idea of the greater good. So this is why we see so many people influenced by television commercials where it's not necessarily the product that makes you feel better, it's the feeling or the feeling you get when you purchase it. So a lot of times you purchase something to maybe avoid being depressed about something, and in 5 minutes after you purchased it, you're back to being depressed again because none of that actually does anything for you. So it's intensity, it's duration, it's certainty or uncertainty, it's propinquity or remoteness. So this is how our general population decides on what they want to do. When they have decisions to make, it's generally on how much pleasure does it bring me. I've been immersed in a world of pain for 15 years, and I'm loving it. And this is actually an aspect of the successful. It's to endure the pain, to delay gratification, bring meaning and purpose into your life, right? So to a number of persons or the community with reference to each of whom the value of a pleasure or pain is considered, it would be greater or less according to 7 circumstances. So they add 3 more to the value of pleasure. So fecundity, fertility, propagation, its purity and its extent. That is the number of persons to whom are affected by it. So this is what silenced so many people into their houses eating fast food during COVID, was this manipulation saying that you must do this for the greater good because it's the best for the greatest number. Okay, this is why they used that phrase, the greater good. Nobody ever went and looked to see who founded it or coined that term or where it came from, except for me. So Bentham's pleasure calculator leading to hedonism and a society largely immersed in instant gratification, while science shows delaying gratification is a prominent personality trait of the successful. So if you stay focused in building something that you want, in creating and completing a task, or like I've done with my farm, we're at a great place now where we've substantiated ourselves with a strong basis of customer and clientele. It's because we delayed gratification and we weren't afraid of pain. And you can't run a farm without pain, both of the mind and the body. But we've been able to refine it and embrace pain. Okay? It's counterintuitive, man. But once you start to understand, don't avoid pain, your whole life changes for the good. At least in my perspective and in my experience, that is exactly what has happened. So, and Bentham didn't stop at the designing utility into the penitentiary. He looked to this brutalist design of the panopticon as ideal for the housing of the poor, hospitals, schools, factories, asylums, and sanitariums. So this is why when you look at all of those buildings, they all look the same, of the brutalist architectural design, nearly. So as I have hopefully demonstrated here, the theory of predictive criminology isn't just a modern day dystopian Hollywood plotline. There has been a move towards crime prediction for longer than any of us have been alive. In fact, it has been the primary motivation of men searching for the perfected modes of social control for well over 200 years and more. It's really their holy grail, to prevent crime before it happens. I ask the reader and the viewer and listener, are we not looking at reasons behind the plot of Philip K. Dick's psychic precogs laying in a vegetative state inside the heart of the special precog division, fused by flash to the omniscient black universe of negative human intention? If you ever seen that movie, it's three sort of half human, I don't know what they are, but they're all combined in this pool of sludge, and they are somehow prognosticators and be able to predict crime before it happens. So this futuristic police station is tied into these precogs, and as soon as they start telling you or creating visions for you to see a crime taking place, they can identify where it's happening and send authority there to try to stop this crime. So Minority Report was preconditioning us to an idea once thought ridiculous, yet an idea that has spanned the millennia, and it is setting roots today. Was Orwell created to precondition us to our inevitable future? Today, there may not be a more referenced book when pointing out the oppressive nature of Western society. Orwell's thought police investigating thought crimes are a thing of the present, and Newspeak relentless today in their subordination of nations through the creation of a wildly fantastical pseudo-environment. So there's Jeremy Bentham's head, still today, preserved in some sort of glass jar. You can go see it. It might be in Philadelphia. I'd like to start my own secret society and collect that brain and that head, and it can be the focal point. So how is what we've uncovered here not our modern day social contract? How is what we are talking about not exactly what Morpheus talked about when first meeting Neo in the movie The Matrix? Where Morpheus says, let me tell you why you're here. You are here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? And Neo says, the Matrix. Morpheus asks, do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us, even now in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is a world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. And Neo asks, what truth? And what does Morpheus say? But that you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. So here we are at the History of Propaganda trying to show you what this matrix actually is so you can see it for yourself. And Louis Brandeis is one of the key makers of our modern day social contract. Okay. So here's a list of our footnotes. Anybody wants to look at those? More than likely, you can find those at archive.org. And I know most of you have an account there by now, so you can just freely and easily go there, put in the title of the book with the author, and end it with archives. And generally, you're going to come up with all of these books as long as they're out of print. Okay. So I'm going to leave you with a positive idea and a positive outlook. Okay. So we largely live in a brave new world, right? This chasing of pleasure. If you haven't read A Brave New World, I encourage you to do so. Orgy porgies, right? What was just happening at Burning Man? The orgy tent collapsed in a windstorm or something. This is what I hear. And so in the Brave New World, it was about orgy porgies. Everybody served each other, and it was just about totally using of each other. It was, you could have sex with anybody at any time that you wanted. Okay, and there was alpha, beta, and different classes of people, and everybody was equal, and nobody could do a thing. Okay, and that's where we're headed, because as I will show you in How Huxley Hijacked Hollywood, he's really the director of the MK Ultra program. You know, Huxley moves to Los Angeles with a bunch of fleeing Marxists from Germany, where he writes A Brave New World at Senary-sur-Mer, the south of France, and he is surrounded by Marxists. And those same Marxists travel with Huxley to Hollywood, 1930s, and they start screenwriting, creating storylines for movies. This is the introduction of film noir and horror movies into our society, deliberately to demoralize the American moviegoer. So in the next couple episodes, I'm going to get into how Huxley hijacked Hollywood and show all the details and sources for all of that. The use of the political salon in Los Angeles, like it was being used in New York with the House of Truth. Okay, they looked at Los Angeles just like they looked at New York, like an experiment, a laboratory. And this is what I'm going to leave you with. So, from A Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. It states in the introduction, on page 6 of the introduction, it starts, only a large-scale popular movement toward decentralization and self-help can arrest the present tendency toward statism. At present, there is no sign that such a movement will take place. Okay, so he wrote that in the foreword of A Brave New World, written in 1930. He said at that time, there was no sign of any self-help movement towards decentralization. Okay, but here we are, the year 2025. We are a self-help and decentralization movement because we need to be better as people. We need to understand the history so that we aren't condemning everybody else to repeat it. So it's about self-help and a move towards decentralization, not centralization and the central bank and all of those things, okay? So I'm going to leave it there. And we're going to get into some more Brandeis stuff later. I'm just going to do it at the end of the show, but we're going to do this another time. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the show. If you are still watching, kudos to you. Well done. Great job. Because you're paying attention to the right thing. And that's not me, that's this history. The progressive era history is what we need to be paying attention to, because they look to our attention as the new data or the new oil. And as long as they have your attention on what they are doing or fear of the future narratives, they win, you lose. The only way we are going to win is if we get involved in a movement of self-help and a move away from centralized banking, centralized statism, okay, and this one world government. So cheers to you all for still being here. Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you later.